I had no idea really what I wanted to do. Like, you're still so young, and by casting the net wide and trying lots of different things, you will find one that clicks and that, resonates with you and you enjoy doing. And then when you find it, when that feeling hits you, then lean into it. And it might start as a hobby, it might start as a side hustle, it might be something you just do for fun. But there is something really powerful about finding something that you enjoy doing and then finding a way to make money from it.
You have reached Escape the 9 to 5. Please leave a message after the tone.
Hi there. I'm doing a boring day job and finding life sucks.
Stuck in a 9 to 5 job and looking for something different? Escape the 9 to 5 is your guide to freedom. Each week, I chat to successful professionals who've either taken the leap themselves or have always done work differently. I also share short daily tips and motivational messages to keep you on track in your career. Escape the 9 to 5 and join us on our journey to a more enjoyable life. You've gone to college, got a very respectable degree and job, but yet you're not satisfied in your current career. Something needs to change. You want more from your career, more happiness, more fulfillment, or maybe even just the feeling you've achieved something even slightly meaningful in your job. You might be thinking, what makes for a meaningful career and who are these people achieving it? How have people escaped the 9 to 5 with a smile on their face? And how have they done it? I'm career coach Dr. Steve Holloway, host and creator of Escape the 9 to 5. My life's mission is to help working professionals like you take the next steps in their professional lives and design a career that works for them. And part of that mission is interviewing some of the most interesting career changes on the planet, top career coaches, as well as regular people like you and me who went from a standard career and decided to walk the path less travelled. Someone who followed that journey is Steve Holloway. He's the co-host of New Zealand's top podcast, Between Two Beers. But before this success, he's someone who had a very interesting career, just following his nose. Going from a soccer scholarship in the States to success as a professional poker player, and then having a very successful traditional career in journalism. Long before he started a podcast in his garage with his mate Seamus, you're going to learn the special skill that served him throughout his career, no matter the job. What he means when he says cast your net wide, and we're not talking about dating. And I'll give you one simple challenge you can do today to help in your own career. But before we do that, a quick message. Thank you for being a fan of the show. If you're enjoying the show and finding it valuable in your career, go ahead and hit the follow button on whatever app you're listening on. This helps the show in more ways than you know, and the bigger the show grows, the better experience you will get. Again, thanks for listening, and I join this week's interview with a very cheeky question for Steve. You did the traditional thing and went to university, although it was in the States. And so my starting question to you, Steve, is, did you learn anything in 4 years of university?
That's a good question. Did I learn anything? I learned how to talk to people and how to... No, you know what I learned? Yeah, I did. I did learn something, because when I left I went to school in New Jersey, Monmouth, New Jersey, and when I left, I was 17, and I left behind everyone I knew. So friends, family, I just went over. I got on a plane, went across to the other side of the world. So more so than what I actually learned in class, which stuck with me, which I don't think I really have retained much of that, was just 4 years of figuring it out and how to talk to people and build connections and relationships and just be independent. But in terms of, because I did a degree in communications, minoring in journalism, and I found that it was like an extension of seventh form. It was kind of, I didn't need to try too hard to get a B.
And we don't really need to get into the details of the university side of things, because I've talked about this with a number of people, but In terms of the journalism side of things, I think you probably would have been better off doing 4 years of actually just doing journalism, and you would have probably learnt more than those 4 years, although I know you were on a soccer scholarship, so there's more to that story than that.
Yeah, the thing is, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went and got a degree in communications because I couldn't think of anything else that was better. And my dad was a journalist, so he was at the Waikato Times for 20 plus years. I knew how to write, and I knew a little bit about the journalism industry. And it was kind of like I sort of fell back into just an easy option. And again, I think one of the keys to being a successful journalist is talking to people. I was in the Herald newsroom for 12 years, and I saw that Dave Leggett and Wyn Gray and all these kind of like legends of New Zealand journalism, they could talk to people. It would be over a beer or on a phone call or in the office, but they just had a way of like building connection, and that's when they got the real gold. And then I saw the younger generation starting to come through, and it was a lot more. They would be on Slack messaging on phones or texting or a bit more hesitant to pick up the phone. So I look at success in journalism as being able, building connections and getting that info and getting that scoop that someone else didn't have because you're out there talking to more people, which, funnily enough, is, I think, a skill that I developed in America.
Yes. It's interesting that you say that, because in my 3 or 4 years of podcasting, the more I've got into it, the more that you talk to people, the more story that you get out of them, as opposed to potentially like I could message you on LinkedIn or some other platform and get some facts about your career, but we really dig into the weeds more having a conversation like this.
Yeah, totally. And funnily enough, like one of the perhaps underrated skills is listening. It's like you need to create the window of, engage someone to talk to you. But then if you actually listen to what they're saying and then ask a question which relates to what they've said, like you don't need to do much more than that. People will just go, because everyone loves hearing themselves talk. So I know this is Rich coming from a guy who hosts a podcast and talks every week, but there is such, there is such magic in just actually listening and listening properly and then asking a good follow-up question.
Kind of on that topic, but I'm someone who absolutely loves to talk, loves talking to people, but I'll be the first to admit that in sort of social conversations, I tend to talk too much. Then as part of my journey, I ended up career coaching, and in that learning to career coach, part of that is essentially learning to actively listen in a very specific way. And it's amazing how much more you can not only learn about someone through active listening, but that they actually learn from themselves by digging deeper, as opposed to just interrupting the conversation and saying your 2 cents worth.
100%. And that is the hardest part of being an interviewer or being a podcast host or talking to someone, is actively being engaged in the conversation and knowing and having in the back of your mind what you're going to ask next, but not letting that take over, so you can stick with the theme if it presents and follow up. And like if I listen, we've done over 200 episodes now, if I listen back to the early ones, man, it's painful. It's kind of like we had a list of questions, and you would ask a question and they'd answer it, and then you'd be like, all right, next question. And it takes skill being comfortable in that space to just really be present in their answer. And sometimes that might result in a bit of silence or a pause, or it doesn't need to like roll into the next question. But sometimes if you just leave a few seconds, then they themselves will follow up, and that's when you get the real gold. You're leaving that.
I'm jokingly leaving a pause.
I thought you'd frozen.
Expecting podcast gold. I will get into your career story, and we're going to talk a lot about your time at New Zealand Herald and stuff. You did the year with the New Zealand Herald when you came back from the US, and then you found yourself as a professional poker player. How did that sort of unfold?
Yeah, when I had a 4-year soccer scholarship in the US, and in the off season I wouldn't come home, but I would like play poker, and this was during the poker boom. So I got quite handy with it, but it was just kind of a hobby. And then I found myself back in New Zealand, and I sort of bounced around a little bit. I'd worked for Oceania Football Confederation for a short window. I'd tried to be a professional footballer. I'd been on trial at a bunch of clubs, but I landed back at my parents' house in Hamilton, and I was early 20s. It was like the height of the global financial crisis. There weren't a lot of jobs, and I was like, what if I commit to being a poker player? Like, how much money can I earn in a month? And so I did it for a month, and I think I earned about $1,000 a week. And I was like, oh, shit, can I do that again? So I was like, right, if I can do this for 3 months in a row, I'm going to call myself a professional poker player, and I'm going to move out. And so I did. So 3 months in a row, I was playing one-on-one tournaments. They're called heads-up tournaments against someone else. And the thing about poker is it's a skill game. In the long term, it's a skill game. In the short term, it can be very much luck. But all you need to do is be better than the players you're playing against. So I was by no means the best in the world, but I game selected quite well, and I was more often than not better than the players I was playing against. So anyway, fast forward 3 years. So for 3 years, I was a professional poker player. I moved to Papamoa, and we lived at Mount Maunganui, and we lived in Queenstown. And on this journey, I met up with a bunch of other professional poker players that played tournaments. So I got one of them, the Scottish guy called Puggy82, and he would back me into tournaments. So I would play $3,000 to $4,000 worth of tournaments every day, which would be about 20 different games at once. By the end of the day, on the 8th hour, that might be a final table. If I was lucky, if I won that, I'd get a good amount of money. But the swings were ridiculous. Like, you can imagine if you're buying in for, you might not win anything for 5 days in a row, and that's 20K, and then you might win a tournament for 27K, and everyone's going crazy, but that's just like a 7K win for the month. So It was quite a surreal world for 3 years. I lived with a guy called Chris Moorman, who is now the winningest online tournament player in history. I think he's won $36 million. I lived with him in Queenstown for a couple of months. His brain, man, if you get inside that man's brain. But then eventually they moved to Vegas. I moved to Auckland with my girlfriend, now wife, and realized it was quite a appealing way to live. Just loading up a computer every morning, playing tournaments against people across the other side of the world. My roommates and friends would go up and go to work. They'd come back. I didn't see a future in it. So the first job I applied for after I decided to retire from professional poker was the sports job at the New Zealand Herald. So did about 3 interviews. I had to explain away the big 3-year gap in my CV and what I've been doing, but they kind of liked the poker thing.
Would have made for an interesting job interview anyway.
Well, they said that it was what got me the job. They loved that, I could make it work for 3 years, and it showed which it did a certain amount of problem solving, which they thought could come in handy. I could write semi well at that point. So it all just worked out.
So then, in the context of your job at New Zealand Herald, the last I saw you were, now according to your LinkedIn, you're still in that job. My understanding is you've gone full time on a different venture, but last I heard you were the sports director at NZME. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I joined the Herald Sport Department in 2012, and at that time it was mostly like print. It was all about print, but they were starting to think digital and think online. So at the time there was only one guy in the digital Herald sports team, Cam McMillan. So I was brought in as his deputy. So there was 2 of us in the team, and it's actually gone in a really interesting arc. Like, that team kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's shrinking down again. I don't know if you've seen the latest redundancy cuts. The sports team is shrinking. It's kind of like trying to figure out its way. But so, I was online sports. I was a deputy online sports editor for about 4 or 5 years. Then I became the online sports editor. And then for the last 6, I was the premium sports editor, which meant anything that went on the paywall went through me. So it was my job to create headlines that would entice people to pay for stories. It was to decide what sort of angles we should chase and what sports we should give attention to. I edited the paper, so what picks go with what headlines, and editing people's work as it came through. So it was a great job, and I had a young family. I've got 4 young kids, so I worked from home in Hamilton for the last 6 years, which gave me really good balance. But at the same time, the problem with New Zealand journalism is, like, once you start climbing that ladder and you get towards the top, there aren't that many different places to go. There's NZME and there's stuff. But if you're a specialized sports journo and you're at the top of the tree, where to next? And I kind of kept looking around at my friends and other professions, and they were all, moving and things kept progressing. And I kind of was just stationary for about 6 years. And so I guess on the side, I'd been developing this podcast, which I used a lot of the skills that I had, but it was also my own thing, which, has...
We will get to the podcast in a moment, but something that I'm interested in diving deeper into is one thing that I've discovered further along in this journey with escaping the 9 to 5. When I first started the podcast, it was very much like a middle finger to the standard job and like doing something completely different. But I've come to realize more and more as I've got into the career coaching space is that it's for each individual person, it's about identifying your unique strengths, building those over time, developing mastery. And then as you develop that mastery, you put yourself in a position where you're a valuable employer or employee, and you have the ability to call the shots in whatever your role is. So before we get to the podcast, something I'm interested in understanding as you, I guess, climb the ladder in a relatively 9 to 5 job is what would you say was your special talent that got you that continued progression in your career?
It's a good question. I think my special talent was my creativity. To start with, I did a lot of live blogs. So it was like, Chiefs are playing the Hurricanes on a Friday night and I was blogging it. And I put my personality into it and I developed a bit of a following with those blogs. People would, tune in week after week because I didn't take myself too seriously and I could insert a little bit of humor and also clearly communicate what was happening. And so I started doing that for All Blacks games and America's Cup and All Whites. And I quite liked the idea of how can I make this the most entertaining possible while also delivering some insight. And I think it's that connection, that combination of skills. I wasn't the best writer and I wasn't the funniest and I didn't have the best insights, but I had enough of each of them to create this pretty entertaining package. And then I started doing I think it's called gonzo journalism, where I put myself at the center of stories. So I did a poker column where I would enter the biggest poker tournaments in New Zealand and write about them. And I wrote about one time I was coming first with 11 people. It was $110,000 for first, and I bowed out and I finished with $5,000 and how I blew it up. I wrote about my quest to run 1 kilometer as fast as Eliud Kipchoge did when he did his sub 2-hour marathon. So he did every kilometer in 2 minutes 52. So I trained for 8 weeks to run 1 kilometer and I did it. And it was the best thing that I've ever done. We've got there was a golf buggy following me around the course. I ran it at Porra Stadium and a drone in the sky, and I did it to the absolute second and then just collapsed. And it was the hardest, most physical thing I've ever had to do. But he did it for 40. The whole point of it was to show that how fast this guy's running. He did it for 42 kilometers. So I had ideas and I followed through on them, which I think is quite rare as well, as people who actually do what they're going to say they do. And then I just think judgment, I knew where the line was. A big part of my game, of my career, became headlines and synopsis. And, when you've got a paywall up, your job is to get more people to get their credit card out to pay for the journalism, but they can't read it, so they don't know what's inside. But if you sell them with enough clever headlines and synopsis and photos and angles, eventually over time, shit, I've been wanting to read 5 of these stories. Okay, fine, I'm going to do it. But you also can't, clickbait gets a bit of a bad name. If what's inside isn't what the headline suggests, people are going to get pissed off. So there's a bit of a line in a game with that, but it's just like problem solving overall, I'd say.
And I'd say you'd say the same thing with podcasting. You want to make a compelling heading so that people click the podcast and they want to listen. But if you don't have the content to then back it up, that only works for so long before people get pissed off and give up on your podcast. I'm interested in terms of that sort of special skill that you've had. I think one of the other special skills that you clearly have is, as you mentioned earlier, the ability to talk to people. And you mentioned about how one of the things you noticed with some of the senior editors at the New Zealand Herald was the ability to talk to people potentially over a few beers. And of course, inevitably this leads to you and a mate of yours, Seamus, coming up with the concept of having a few beers and starting a podcast. Can we elaborate on how Between Two Beers started?
Seamus and I are best friends of 25 years. We went to Hamilton Boys High together. He was a few years older than me. And we're genuinely very inquisitive people. We love asking people about their lives and their routines and what's made them successful and what's made them tick. And we were both working at Melville United football team. This was about 6 years ago. He was the manager. I had played the season before but been injured, so I decided to go down and I'd sort of film some stuff. Two of our best mates were coaching, and we just had a lot of fun with it. And I remember thinking we should do something, but didn't really know what it was. I was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time, a lot of long form ones, Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, these shows that would go for like 2 or 3 hours. And I kind of remember thinking, why is no one in New Zealand doing that? Like, these are the most popular podcasts in the world, but I didn't really see anyone in New Zealand doing it. So again, I had an idea and just followed through on it. I was like, Shay, we're going to start a podcast. I went and bought a $200 microphone from JB Hi-Fi. And I said, our first guest is going to be Aaron Scott. So Aaron was the captain of Melville at the time, and he'd been in all white and he'd lived a pretty interesting life. And we got him into my garage in Glenview, Hamilton, and just, we talked it out. I actually went back and listened to it because we did a live show last year where we talked about how terrible the first episode was. And it was like I spoke about, it was awful. Like I don't think we let him speak for the first 12 minutes. We were doing these big, long, rambling intros and talking about each other before we even addressed him in the room. But we enjoyed it. And I remember leaving the garage that night thinking, let's do another one. And we didn't even know how to put a podcast out. Like, it took ages before it went on Spotify and Apple. I think we uploaded it to SoundCloud and put it on YouTube with just a picture of Aaron. And I think it got about, 20 views in the first month. And we didn't care. We were just like, all right, who's next? Who's next? And then the second guest was a guy called Paul Nixon. And this was a bit of a game changer for us. Paul Nixon was my high school football coach and bit of a character, like a lad who loved a drink and had a professional football career. But he'd also lost his wife to cancer. And so he raised his 4 kids by himself after she passed. And it was a part of his life that I had never asked him about, but always wanted to. And by inviting him round to come into the space with us, I said, we're going to talk about your whole life, like the highs and the lows. He said, yeah, ask me anything. And we had this amazing chat about this part of his life that I'd always been interested in, but never found the time or place for. And I remember thinking, there's something special there. Putting a microphone in front of someone's face gives you permission to ask questions that you wouldn't otherwise. And that was kind of the beginning.
Oh, that's what I wanted to mention is your attitude to podcasting really applies to anyone's career, is just taking action and trying things and not really worried about the outcome, just doing it anyway, not worried about the judgment, just doing things. What caused you or what inspired you to start that podcast in the first place? Like, there would be 100 other people in the exact same situation as you. They've got a good mate that they love talking to and they think, I listen to podcasts all the time and there's no long form podcast in New Zealand. And they talk about starting it. They talk about opening their own bar or starting their own podcast, but they just don't do it. What do you think is that special ingredient that caused you to just say, bugger it, I'm just going to start it, or we're going to start it?
Yeah. This is a really important question. Like the whole reason we are where we are, like full-time in the business, and we've got this big audience and building businesses off it, is because in those first 2 years, we did it because it was our favorite time of the week. Like, we enjoyed it. We didn't care how many people were listening. The thought of making money from it never crossed our mind. It was genuinely just because we loved that time. Like, we created a time where we were having fun. And I think about now, the podcast market is starting to get quite saturated. People love the idea of starting a podcast, and some will. And I think there's some stat that, most podcasts 90% of podcasts don't get past episode 7 or something, because people realize that it's actually quite a lot of work. You record it and then you've got to edit it and put an intro on and upload it, and it becomes a job very quickly. And so the reason that we stuck with it is because to us it wasn't a job, it was fun. And then we also didn't need a lot to put the wind in our sails. Like we started quite early on, we developed a little sort of football community that really loved the show. And I remember us saying like all it took was 1 or 2 comments from people saying, loved the chat. That was so awesome. Can't wait to see who's next or something like that. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
all right. And then we could slowly see the snowball start to build. But again, like with no visions of anything bigger. So I think a lot of people, they start with the goal in mind that, oh, this is going to be a thing. And it's really hard to grow and develop an audience in the podcast scene. You know, it's taken us 5 years of consistently like putting quality out every week. And that's the kind of the time frame you have to be thinking of. If you're thinking you're going to go in and develop an audience with a quick hit, like it's just not going to happen.
It also applies to your career in general too. I know it's a super cliche, but enjoying the journey, not the destination, or aiming for the destination. Because the reality is, if you're focusing on that job in 5 years' time where you're sitting on the beach and working on your laptop, it's not actually relevant. It's not actually the thing that's going to get you to that perfect job. It's like you've got to actually enjoy the daily thing that then gets you to a potential end destination. But in your guys' case, it's not like it's an end destination anyway. And I think it comes to nicely to where are you with Between Two Beers now in terms of what I'm familiar with the podcast, of course, but you mentioned it's a multi-dimensional business now.
Yeah, so last year was an incredible year for us. I was still working at the Herald part-time. I'd gone down to 2 days a week at the start of the year. And by February, I was in a position to kick it clear. But we didn't have enough to pay 2 salaries. So the plan was that I was going to go full-time on the podcast and develop revenue streams to bring Seamus up. Our goal was to get him full-time as well by the end of 2024. And it ended up happening a lot quicker than that. I think by the middle of the year, we were both full-time with the podcast. And yeah, you talk about the journey, like what an exhilarating ride. Like as business owners, I'd been, in a cog in the machine at NZME for 12 years. And now all of a sudden I was out on my own and bringing my best mate along with me. And so there's kind of like, I've got 4 kids. I've got a decent mortgage. There's no safety net all of a sudden, but I've felt like I've never been as motivated or fired up to make something work as when it's your own. So we quickly realized that, we kind of needed to diversify. It can't just be the podcast is the most important thing, but if there's opportunities for other revenue streams, then we need to kind of lean into that too. The first thing we launched was a speaking company called B2B Speakers. We realized we were very uniquely placed with great relationships with a lot of New Zealand's most successful people. And we can sort of advertise them. They'll come on our podcast to share their story. And then we'll say, at the start and the end of the episode, if you liked this and would like this guest to tell their story at your event, contact us at B2B Speakers. Right. So that book has, really good. We've got about 60 of New Zealand's biggest names on that book yet. And it's sort of growing. It's a tough industry. Celebrity speakers, the big fish in that sea. And we're kind of attempting to challenge that and shift things. But that's been an exciting ride, and we've learned a lot about business. And then the other one is it's a business called Reflections, and it's bespoke podcasts to capture your family story. So say your mum or dad has lived an incredible life, but their story hasn't properly been captured. We will come and capture it. It can be video or audio only. We will come to their house. We'll put the same amount of prep that we do for the podcast, but for your family. And these are for private. Right. They're not for public broadcast. But we kind of realized that what we were doing could be so important and priceless, really, to so many families. And the genesis of it was when I had my dad on the podcast. And this was guest like 30. And I realized This is going to be really valuable one day. I haven't listened back to it yet, but one day I will. And no one else in New Zealand is really doing it. And we've got this big, we've got a well-trusted and well-respected brand. We've got a big marketing funnel. So, yeah, that business is growing quite quickly. And we're really excited about what that looks like in 2025.
I would say that's an awesome business idea. And I know, for example, my dad, who's 75, he recently did a family history, like he put this well-made book together. And I think there's something you get to a certain age where you want to document your life. And there's a lot of people that they might not be the sort of person that wants to write their own book, but most people do want to share their story. And I think with the relatability that you and Seamus have, makes it easy for people to talk to you. And I think that I guess comes down to being a good podcaster, really, is interviewing people in a like friendly and relatable and non-aggressive way.
Yeah, so there's a lot of models out there, like Storybook, I think is the most popular one, where people write, it's like a chapter a month or something, and there's quite a bit of admin that goes on. The difference with what we're doing is like we're turning up, and often the guest is kind of almost unwilling. It's like their son or daughter has wanted them to do it, and they're not really sure about it, but they've said they'll do it. And by the end, they love it because it's just so rare to get someone, again, listening and asking you questions about your lives. So we did one with a guy who was 95 and he lives in Warkworth, and him and his family had come over from South Africa. And so him talking about his parents and the wars and things, like I could see it in his eyes. He hadn't spoken about it for 20, 30 years, and especially in that depth, and it gets quite emotional. I'll tell you another one. So obviously the space lends itself, but it lends itself to people with terminal illness. And I got contacted by a guy who had terminal motor neuron disease, and he lived in Auckland, and he'd been a police officer for 30 years. He'd worked his way up in the court system, like a really distinguished career. But this thing was coming quite quickly. And so he organised for me to come and capture his life story as a farewell for his family and his kids. And it was the most important and saddest conversation of my life. And at the end, we just sat there and wept, and like just powerful. Like there's so much clarity at that point of your life. And I remember thinking, how am I here? Like, how have I got into this man's living room to capture his life story based on a business we started from a podcast that started in my garage? And it's kind of like these little twists and turns of this journey we talked about are just incredible. The hardest part for us as the podcast is growing and all these other things is figuring out how to prioritize our time. So we've actually brought in two of New Zealand's best journalists to do these interviews for us. So it's not always Seamus and I that have to be the ones, but under our same brand, our same style and our same level of quality.
That's incredible. It leads nicely to another question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what is the most impactful lesson that you've learned from a guest on any of your time podcasting?
Oh man, there's been so many. I think what can speak to sort of our success, and Seamus hates when I speak on his behalf, but I'm going to anyway, is surrounding yourself with the right people. Like the people and the connections we've made across this journey have so much elevated us. And when you're around other ambitious, thoughtful, caring people who are all just like trying to get better in every aspect of life, it just rubs off on you. So it's that whole, you are the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. Like I truly believe that. The other one that stands out, and there's so many, like we actually have a keynote with like 10 of these. I'll say the one that sprung to mind is Hayley Holt. So her message was send the text, which I love. She had some battles in her life. She was quite public with her alcoholism. She suffered a miscarriage after being really public about her pregnancy news.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
She said, like, when that happened, when it broke about her miscarriage, she received hundreds of texts, and she couldn't reply to them all. It was too many. But the fact that people like were texting meant the world to her. And I always think about that. Do you ever think, like, if someone sends you something nice, or they've listened to a podcast you've done, or they've maybe read an article, or whatever it is in your life, and you get a text from someone that you're not expecting, say, hey, I really enjoyed that. Like, it makes you feel so good. And so, like, why not do that the other way? Why not do that anytime and I've started doing it, and it actually makes you feel really good. But the response back is just like so grateful. You read an article, you trace down the journalist, say, hey, I really enjoyed that article. You listen to a podcast, flip them a message, great job. And send the text and surround yourself with good people, I'd say.
And I think to the point of the text thing is, it's not like doing it with an agenda, like, I really enjoyed your news article, can you post my story?
Yeah, totally.
It's actually just putting the energy out into the world. And it's quite similar to the concept that people who give gifts actually feel better than the person who receives the gift.
Yep.
So it's actually, in its own bizarre way, like a self-beneficial thing.
Yeah, totally. I will say one more, and it's actually just working hard. Like, this is going to be the most basic advice, but it just comes through time and time again. And I think to Chris Wood, right? Chris Wood is currently like one of the hottest strikers in the Premier League, age 34, having his best career of his life. We had him on the show, and we spoke about those 7 years when he was early 20s, and he went over to England, and he was just put out on loan. Like he was on
And he
loan.
was a nobody, right?
He was just battling away in the lower leagues, and he went from team to team, feeling uncomfortable at each one, moving his life around. But he put his head down and he worked hard, and he never complained. Like he just saw them as, all right, this is the next obstacle. I'm going to work through it. And then we had Lisa Carrington on, and in the same vein, it's like she didn't miss a training for 3 years. Like, she felt sick sometimes, she was in pain sometimes, but she always got up and she just worked through, and she just worked harder than anyone else. And I think that reflects a little bit on our journey too as podcasters, because I'm pretty confident to say we work harder than anyone else. We put 10 to 12 hours each of research in for every guest, and then we come together. And because we know their stories so well and we talk to so many people about their lives, that helps us create the most interesting and insightful conversations because of the work we do in the background.
Yeah, I absolutely love that concept. And it comes to the idea of, I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Slight Edge,
I don't know.
but it's essentially, the idea is making those small decisions every day. The best example I can give is you go to a cafe and you have the choice between a salad and a chocolate cake. And on a one-off basis, choosing the chocolate cake seems really harmless, but actually choosing the salad, even in those moments, choosing the salad in the long run, it's just that mentality that I'm going to make the good choice here. And this isn't to say to our listeners, don't ever enjoy a chocolate cake or ever enjoy a dessert. The point I'm trying to make is Chris Wood could have just Saturday and Sundays just been like, oh no, I'm not going to train today. Or Lisa Carrington's example, she could have been like, I'm not feeling 100%, I'm not going to train. But it's those small little decisions every single day that over the long term compound in the same way as interest compounds in your bank account. And if you continue to work hard and continue to make the right choice, whether it be podcasting, playing football, or in any career, in the long run, that's going to compound, and that's going to give you the slight edge over everyone else.
Man, I couldn't agree more. And I think of all of the little things in my life which are the most beneficial, and they've always been the hardest. Like that example you gave, for me, I do the cold shower thing, right? I've been doing cold showers for 3 years.
Don't get me started.
So morning and night. And it's that decision, right? You turn the handle, and do you turn it to, oh, nice and comfortable, or do you turn it to cold as it can get? And you win that little sort of psychological battle at the start of the day. And you're like, oh, you do it in the middle of winter at 5 a.m. You're like, this is going to be the hardest thing I'm going to do all day. And you win it. And other parts of my life, which are huge now. So I do the fasting where, I'll often just eat one meal a day. So like I'll have like a 4-hour eating window. And it was so hard, man. For the first, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, it was really hard. And then you sort of retrain your body. And I've been doing it for 4 years, and it works for me. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's something that was hard to start with. And now I love it. Swimming is another one. Like when I used to run a lot, I loved running. It was one of the pillars of my life. I've got terrible arthritis in both of my hips now, and I can't run anymore. If I tried to run 500 meters, I'll be in pain. So I had to decide what to do. And I hated swimming, but I realized it had to be swimming. So I went and, at 38 years old, and got swimming lessons, and I couldn't swim 2 lengths, and I hated it, but I kept going back. And now I swim 4 or 5 times a week, and it's one of the favorite parts of my life. And, I just see it time and time again. It's like lean into the uncomfortableness.
Our listeners won't see, but throughout that conversation, I was just indicating my approval. I've actually had 2 cold showers today. And I think people would be like, oh, that's ridiculous. It's not got any benefit to anything whatsoever. But I think what it's actually doing is training your brain it's essentially training resilience, especially in a world where everything's so easy. You've got the warm shower. You don't have to go for the swim. Your food's delivered to you. Everything's so easy. It's giving yourself challenges that your brain's, I'm going to push through this, so that then applying it to your career, when you're having a crappy day and you don't feel like doing work, or you have that thing that you need to practice, you've already trained your brain to kind of silence that voice, because everyone's got that voice in their head, right? Everyone's got the voice in their head that's, oh, you don't need to do it. Like, just take it easy today, Steve. Are you familiar with David Goggins?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I know Goggins.
Yeah, because I listened to a podcast interview of his recently, and I had always assumed that someone like him, for context to our listeners who don't know who he is, David Goggins is like an ultra marathon runner, and he's just got this incredible career story or life story about being this like overweight guy to becoming this ultra marathon runner. And I used to always think of it as he'd got to the point where he can block the part of his brain that feels pain or doesn't want to do things. But actually, even now, after all these years, when he goes for a run, he still has that voice in his head saying, don't do it. Like, you don't need to do it. But he's just trained the sort of resilience muscle essentially to say, no, I'm not going to listen to that voice and I'm going to make the better choice.
Yeah. Yeah, man, he's so impressive. Is it like, who's going to carry the boats? Or something? He's got like that phrase, and he just is like whenever he's really hurting. Yeah, man, no way can I compare myself to that guy is built different. But yeah, the themes remain the same. And the other one I should add is young kids, like for young kids, it is leaning into that uncomfortable life is throwing everything at you, and you're kind of like, you realize it's just a season and you're in the trenches, and the long view is you have this amazing family. Oh, I've got an amazing family now, but they grow up and you get to sort of enjoy that. And it's just like, well, at the moment it's hard.
Yes. I can really resonate too, having a young family and starting a podcast. Like I started my first podcast when our baby was still on the, what's it called, the wrap. Yeah. And I was like typing podcast notes while she's like crying. That leads nicely into like last question, which is, what is the biggest challenge that you've faced in recent years, Steve?
Yeah, look, I'll tell you, the biggest challenge I've faced in the last year, it's prioritizing time. And honestly, it's prioritizing time with my wife and our relationship. So much happened in 2024. 4 kids, we moved into a new house, business going gangbusters, like traveling and speaking and things, and realizing that like the relationship needs work too, and that's not just going to always, it's not going to feed itself. And even though we are in this incredibly challenging period of our life with lots going on, like we need to prioritize time for each other and talk to each other. And so sort of I did this list of goals just to start the year off, and one of them was like a date night with my wife once a week. And that's really hard to do. Like we need to get a babysitter to come around and look after the kids for an hour so we can go out for a walk. And it's challenging because it always seems like, oh, it's too much work, it's been too long of a week. But that's always going to be the reason. So you got to sort of fight for, and I realize to your listeners, like I'm probably in a bit of a unique place. Like a lot of them don't have 4 kids or don't have that, but that's the thing that I've struggled with the most this year is finding the right time and energy to invest into a relationship, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing of all of it. That is the rock that everything else, once that starts to fall apart, like it all falls apart. So it's reprioritizing the relationship and putting that first.
And it's really interesting because from a purely like logical point of view, you could argue that your career success is independent of your relationship with your wife and your family. But interestingly for me, in the time in my life when life got so busy in the last 3 years with a young kid, and not having that much time for myself has also been the time that I've had the most career success. I don't know what the psychology is around it, but it's like having that deeper purpose motivates me in a way that I wouldn't have been motivated when I was 25 and single and mucking around with my mates.
Yeah, totally. There's no fire under your bum quite like for young kids and a mortgage, and you've gone out on your own and you've told your wife you're going to make it work, but at the same time giving her enough time to be a good husband and stay at home. There's a lot going on there, but once I figure it out, I'll be able to tell you how.
So I did make a mistake there, Steve. I do actually have one more question for you, which is the closing tradition of this podcast is to ask the guests, essentially, if you go back to when you were 25, knowing what you know now, What is the one piece of career advice you would give to yourself?
I would tell 25-year-old Steve to try as many things as he can. When I was 25, I was a professional poker player, and I had no idea really what I wanted to do. Like, you're still so young, and by casting the net wide and trying lots of different things, you will find one that clicks and that, resonates with you and you enjoy doing. And then when you find it, like when that feeling hits you, then lean into it. And it might start as a hobby. It might start as a side hustle. It might be something you just do for fun. But and this is going to be quite, who am I, right? I've been a business owner for a year. This might all go tits up. I was a journalist for 12. Like, who am I to be giving this kind of advice? But there is something really powerful about finding something that you enjoy doing and then finding a way to make money from it. So with the internet and the opportunities out there to make money or have fun doing different things, like, the opportunity is there if you want it bad enough and if you're smart enough with it. So be strategical, but cast the net wide is what I'm saying. Cast the net wide, try as many things as possible, and then find the one that sticks.
Yeah, it's a really good piece of advice. If you think about it like relationships, if you were to get married at 18, you get introduced to this girl, your parents recommend you go on this date with this girl, and you get married when you're 18. I hope this doesn't actually apply to your dating story, but you get married when you're 18, and that's the only girl you ever meet. It's really limiting your, like, putting you down this path that you might not end up being a very good match with this person. But if most of us these days do date quite a bit in our early 20s in the context of heterosexual guys, date different women, and then the one where there's that the best compatibility is the one that you end up choosing, to your point about casting your net wide. But a lot of people go to university based on decisions they made when they were 16 or 17 and then find themselves in a career. And that's essentially my audience is people that have gone down that standard path. And so I think your advice about casting your net wide is actually very good, especially early in your career when you can afford to make those mistakes.
I'm glad it landed. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I nailed that one.
That was Steve Holloway, journalist and co-founder of Between Two Beers. You can find out more about Steve at his website, b2bspeakers.co.nz, or listen to their podcast, Between Two Beers. 3 tips from Steve. 1. Get good at talking to people and building relationships. Do not underestimate the power of relationships and the unexpected opportunities it might create. 2. Work hard and turn up. Make the slight-edge choice. Turn up when no one else does and play the long game, knowing that, like New Zealand's most successful professional footballer, success does not happen overnight. 3. Cast your net wide. Try loads of things. You don't know what you want from your career without trying a load of things. This week's challenge? Create a super job description.
Challenge accepted.
Do you want a job like Steve's, where he's literally turned his hobby into a career? If you listen to last week's episodes, you'll hopefully have completed a strengths assessment of sorts. Now, using your top 5 strengths, identify careers that are common amongst all of your strengths, and create a job description that matches your perfect job. Even better, use an AI prompt. And if you're needing help, contact me via my website in the show notes, and I'll help you speed up this process to create your super job description. So this week, create a super job description.
Challenge accepted.
Thanks for listening to Escape the 9 to 5. Again, if you're enjoying the show and finding it valuable in your career, go ahead and hit the follow button on whatever app you're listening on. This helps the show in more ways than you know, and the bigger the show grows, the better experience you will get. I'm career coach Dr. Steve Holloway, your host, and thanks for being part of our movement. See you next time. Escape the 9 to 5 is a Deals Media production. This show is produced and created by me, Steve Holloway. Show theme is by Mikey Geiger, and background music is created by Soundstripe. If you'd like to reach me personally, you can visit my coaching website, nextstepcareers.nz. Thanks for tuning in to Escape the 9 to 5. I'm looking forward to you joining us on our journey to a more enjoyable life.